And all God's people said, Amen. Thank you so much. I was 7 years old and Christmas was coming up. I knew exactly what I wanted, but I didn't think that I would ever be able to get it. I wanted a flashlight, not just any flashlight. I wanted this special flashlight that I had seen that threw a focused beam and was a 5-cell flashlight. That's 5D cells, it was a pretty long handle on it. Well, lo and behold, Christmas came, and I got that flashlight. I was so excited and thrilled about that. I'd stay awake at night, look out my bedroom window at the garden in the backyard, and I could point that flashlight out the window, and I could watch the eyes of the rabbits as they began to make a mess in the garden and get into things they weren't supposed to be into. I enjoyed those fat flashlight, although I never seemed I could afford to keep it in batteries. It was something that I was so excited about. And for many years, it used to sit right beside my bed for all those special occasions. Light has always been fascinating to me. But a few years later, I got my first telescope for Christmas. It was just a little telescope, a little reflector, but it was really special. And my parents give me a flashlight to go with it. Not a big 5-cell flashlight like that, but instead a little flashlight that had red light so it wouldn't affect my eyes when I would be out there looking at the stars and still be able to follow a star chart and reading. Light comes in all sizes and shapes and colors. And light is a big part of our life. And the older we get, the more we appreciate light. If you don't believe me, watch all these old-timers going like this. You know what I mean? They really depend on that light and try to get as close to it as they can to take advantage of all that they could get from it. Jesus had a lot to say about light. In fact, he talked about himself as the light of the world, not just like the sun, but more importantly, he talked about the connection between light and life. And when he said he was the light of the world, he also said that he was the light of life. Without light, it's pretty difficult to have life. It's something pretty essential. When you're wandering in the world, struggling, trying to find direction, you just want someone to shine a light on the path that you're supposed to take. When you're attempting to make decisions, and there are options before you, and you stand there bewildered and confused about which direction you should go, you want someone to show a light on that path that you should take. You want the clarity and the vision and the understanding that light brings to us. And that's precisely what Jesus did. Throughout the Gospel of John, light, life, and love are themes that he weaves in every chapter, through every story, to try to help us understand the connectedness of what it means for God's love to be showered upon us that brings us light so that we can see the world, ourselves, and Him. And so that we can respond in the sense of real life. In the Gospel of John, There are many feasts in Jerusalem where Jesus takes a journey with his disciples and goes up to the feast. In chapters 6, 7, and 8, there is a feast they're celebrating in the fall of the year. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or in the Old Testament, the Feast of Booths. It was a feast that commemorated the wilderness experience. It celebrated God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt, their crossing of the Red Sea, and for 40 years, their journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land. There were several things that the Feast of Tabernacles focused upon. Yes, even today, Orthodox Jews set up a little booth, a little tent in the front yard, and during that feast for 8 days, they and their kids camp out there, and they celebrate that. But it's not really about the booth. It's not really about the camping. It's about God. And it's about 3 things that God did in that wilderness experience. First, throughout the wilderness, as they made that journey, God made it very clear that they were dependent upon him. There's no way they could carry supplies for 40 years in the wilderness. There's no way they could find sustenance to survive in that wilderness. So the first thing they celebrated was the bread that God supplied. What was that bread called? The manna, the bread from heaven. And guess what? In chapter 6, Jesus feeds the 5,000 and tells them, I am the bread of life. I am the real bread, the true bread that came down from heaven. Oh, your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, but I am the bread of life. The second thing they celebrated in that wilderness experience was water. If you've ever been in a wilderness, you know how important water is. And they didn't find water in springs or brooks or creeks or even cisterns. They struggled to find water, but God supplied. He brought the water from a rock. And they drank from that rock the water of life throughout the wilderness experience. So guess what? In chapter 7, Jesus says, I'm the living water. And if you believe in me, that water springs up within to bring life. Then in chapter 8, Jesus mentions the third thing in that wilderness that was important. They needed the bread. They needed the water. But they needed direction. And so God came to them, and his presence was visible by his Shekinah glory. And it shone in the wilderness as a pillar of cloud by day. And at night, it blazed like a pillar of fire. The cloud went before them to show the way. And when the cloud stopped, they stopped. And when the cloud moved, they moved. When they finally completed that tabernacle in the wilderness that God gave instructions to Moses up on Mount Sinai, and they dedicated that tent, that tabernacle, that cloud, the Shekinah glory of God, came and dwelt upon the Ark of the Covenant and was visible above that tabernacle in the wilderness. It provided the light for several things. the light to show the way, but the light also to shine in their heart and to remind them of the presence and the love and the care of God. In that 8th chapter of John, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And he calls that light the light of life. 3 things we've looked at already in previous weeks. Throughout this month of January, I've wanted to introduce you to Jesus. And so I've entitled these series, the Meet My Jesus. And we've looked at different aspects of who Jesus is. And today, I want us to focus upon him in terms of the light of life and what he means by that, for he spells it out rather clearly for us. I'm going to begin, though, where John begins. So turn with me to the very first chapter of John. And I would like for you to stand as I read the first 9 verses. Now, there's a tremendous lot in these verses, but just focus on what he says about the light. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world. And all God's people said, amen. Thank you, and be seated. There is much in those opening verses of John. But I want you to hear what he said about that light. That light came into the world to give life. Real life. And he said that light lighteth the life of every man that cometh into the world. In other words, sometime in the life of every human being, the light of life comes and makes himself known and gives us the opportunity to respond. Paul would say to Titus that the Spirit of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men. That in the course of our lifetime, each one of us will be confronted with the light of life, with the message and revelation of God, and have that opportunity to respond. I'm going to be speaking primarily today from one verse in that 8th chapter of John, verse 12. It's the verse where in that Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus says that he's the light of the world. It's an important verse because it outlines specifically what it means for Jesus to be light. Look with me at John 8, verse 12. Notice what it says. There in verse 12, then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. There are three phrases that Jesus gives us in that verse. Number one, I am the light of the world. Number two, he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. And number three, but shall have the light of life. I want to take each one of those three phrases and discuss with you what it means for Jesus to say, I am the light of the world. First of all, when he says, I am the light of the world, he is talking about the source of divine light. Light comes from him. I am the light of the world. Yes, this is one of those 7 great I am sayings of the Gospel of John, where Jesus doesn't use the normal way of saying I am, which would just be a me, but instead he emphasizes it and says, ego eimi. I wish we would translate it literally. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. Over and over again, when Jesus uses that unusual term, I am, he is putting the emphasis upon himself, the unique position that God has given him, and the role that he has. He is identifying himself as the source. The identity of the source of divine life is in Christ. The whole Gospel of John is about this. Back in that first chapter, Jesus says in verse 18 that he has come into the world in order to declare or reveal the Father. He wants to shine the light on God. He wants us to see God. He says no one has ever seen God at any time because God's a spirit. But if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Jesus wants us to understand that he is the source of divine life. That's where it comes from. That's how it gets into this world. He is the one who was that pillar of light that led the children of Israel in the wilderness. He's the one that shined forth to bring such a majestic difference. Now, there are a few, but only a few, very special people who got to see that light in all of its brilliance. Most people saw that light on the face of Jesus Christ. They saw that light clothed in the clay of human flesh. But if you remember, there were 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, that had a very unusual experience. It was not available to the other disciples yet. Those 3 were able to go up to a mountain alone with Jesus. There they experienced a cloud that engulfed them. There they heard a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." And there they saw Jesus like no one else saw. They saw him transfigured. And they were so overawed and bewildered and amazed. They didn't know how to describe it. They said, we saw him in his glory. He was like a bright light. His clothing was whiter than anybody could make it here on earth, no matter what cleaner you went to. They described the way he reflected and was the glory of God. So in verse 14 of that first chapter of John, John confesses something that he experienced with Peter and James. He says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Peter was overwhelmed at that too, and in his letters, he describes how he was on that mountain and he saw the glory of the Lord. He saw Jesus as he really is, beyond the clothing of flesh that he wore when he became man. They got to peer at his majesty. Jesus is coming again. And when he comes again, that glory of God will not be clothed with flesh. Instead, he will come in his majesty. John calls it in the book of Revelation his glorious appearing. At his second coming, every eye shall see him. And it'll be such an overwhelming experience that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Because no longer will his glory be veiled, but instead it'll be fully evident for all to see. What a marvelous experience. I'm looking forward to that day. There's a lot of details that we could talk about in terms of light. I don't think it's any accident that when you run light through a prism, it breaks down into three primary colors: red, yellow, and blue. And they have often been symbolized as the Trinity. But it also breaks those down into secondary colors. And guess what? There are 7 of those in a spectrum that comes through a prism. The perfect number. And in that we get to see the perfection of that white light. I'll just leave that to chew on for a moment. Let's look at the next part of that. We not only have Jesus saying that he's the source of the light, but the proximity of that source. This is amazing. We like light. Every one of you who came in today said something to me about, gee, it's a nice, bright, sunny day out there today. It doesn't feel like January, you know. Why? Because we like that sun. That sunshine feels so good. It raises the temperature. It raises the sense of joy in our heart and life. It banishes the clouds. It just pokes holes in darkness and suddenly changes our whole attitude. Something happens when the sun shines. You wanted to get out and be in it yesterday. It was an exciting time. But let me tell you something. That sun is 93 million miles away. Now, I don't know whether that means anything to you or not. It doesn't mean a whole lot to me. A million is something I can't comprehend, and 93 of them doesn't mean that much more. But I know that light travels at 186,300 miles a second. And that's fast. And even though light travels that fast, it takes 8.5 minutes for that sunlight to go from the sun, traveling those 93 million miles, and reach us here on Earth. So what you're seeing outside is already 8.5 minutes old, okay? Now, what Jesus is saying is that He is the light of the world, and His light is immediate and present. You don't even have to wait 8.5 minutes. He is near us, with us, and He promises, I will never leave you nor forsake you. That the light of life that He offers is something that can be with us permanently, near us, not distant, not far, not just dreamed of, but something that can be truly within us. During the Christmas season, on Wednesday nights, we studied the beautiful hymns that Luke recorded for us that the early church sang about the birth of Jesus. And one of them was the hymn that Zacharias sings when his son John was born. And he picks up John and holds him in his arms. And he says, "But thou, child." And he begins to talk how John will be the forerunner, the witness for the Messiah. And then in verses 78 and 79, he says this about the coming Messiah. He says, "Through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the dayspring from on high hath visited us, to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace." Zacharias was looking for that light that would come from God. He was like the passage that Kevin read earlier, those who sit in darkness. Suddenly upon them the light shines. Suddenly into their world there comes the wonderful peace that light brings. When I was a child, I used to get frightened at night about the dark. My mom and dad would tuck me in bed at night upstairs. And they'd come down and sit and listen to the radio. And there would be shadows on my wall, and shadows that seemed to race across the floor. And I imagined all kinds of things lurking in the closet and under the dresser. And many times, in that fear and anxiety, I'd call out to my mom and dad. And my dad would come up the stairs. And the first thing he would do would be to flip on the light switch. And you know what happened? All those fears went away. Suddenly the light was there and the shadows were gone. Suddenly the darkness fled and the fear dissipated. That's exactly what happens when Jesus comes into your light. He comes into your life as the light that casts out the darkness, and as Zacharias says, he not only guides our path, but he brings peace. And that's the wonderful news about this light of life. He not only brings new life to us, But he fills that life with his presence that pokes holes in all the dark corners, that ends the anxieties and the fears, and brings to us a sense of wonderful peace. What comfort that source of divine light is. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. But the second thing he says in that phrase points us to something more. And that is not just the source, but the course, the direction of divine light. The second phrase, he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. Our life is a pilgrimage. We're on a journey. And sometimes that journey can be confusing and bewildering and overwhelming and dark and frightening. Sometimes it leads through dark valleys and difficult passages. Sometimes it brings sickness and sorrow and grief and longing and suffering and pain. And into those doubts and fears and difficult moments, Jesus comes as the course of divine light, that direction. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. When you make that commitment to follow Christ, the darkness vanishes. And suddenly you know where you're going. You have a purpose. You have a goal. You have a direction. You have an understanding. You have a companion who is lighting the way. He gives us his word, and it's a light for us. David put it in the language of his day. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. He depended on hearing that Savior speak day by day so that he would know the direction that he should go. He says in Psalm 145, verse 8, that each morning when he arises, he not only praises the Lord, but he says, cause me to know the way wherein I should walk. I'm starting a new day. And as a king, I've got lots of plans. My day timer is full. But it's not about me and my day timer. It's about you and your direction for my life. So here I'm starting a new day. And I want you to cause me to know the way wherein I should walk. Today I want to live for you. Today I want to follow your direction. Today I don't want to go my way. I want to go your way. And that's what the light of life does. He comes into our life to give us a sense of direction. For it's the light of knowledge, first of all. A light of knowledge. He came to guide us. I love the way Paul says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6. Where he puts it this way, for God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Just like God said, let there be light in the beginning, and he broke the darkness of creation and brought in the light. By the way, he didn't create the sun until the fourth day. So the light he brought in the beginning was a very different kind of light. It wasn't sunlight or moonlight or starlight. We have the fourth day to wait for those. This is the first day, the very beginning. And God says, let there be light, and there was light. And that's what happens into your life too. The moment you accept Jesus Christ, he says, let there be light. And the first thing you see is the glory of God on the face of Jesus Christ. And it begins to shine in your heart. And it brings such a sense of warmth and love and grace. No longer does the face of God have a frown on it, looking at you with wrathful eyes, ready to sentence you to an eternity of hell. No. When you accept Christ, you see the light of the glory of God on the face of Jesus Christ that says, I've taken care of it. I paid for every last bit of it. It's all forgiven. It's all forgotten. Now, let's make this pilgrimage together. Let's go through life in a wonderful sense of peace and victory. It's the light of fellowship. That when you accept Christ as the light of life, you suddenly enter into a relationship where you're walking with Jesus. And there is a fellowship that is overwhelming. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness. You're following him. Every step of the way, you're right with him. That fellowship brings joy and peace and direction and comfort and hope and a sense of purpose and destiny because you know where you're going. You're following the Master. It's also a light of holiness. A light of holiness. There are so many verses that talk to us about what happens when that light shines on us and changes what happens. In Hebrews, for example, chapter 12, verse 14, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. This then is the message which we have heard of him, and we declare it unto you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. That when we begin to follow him, the light begins to show the inadequacies in ourselves. But we see what we could be in the life of Christ. And suddenly we want to change. We want to undergo a transformation that not only just cleans us up for the moment, but begins to reorder our thinking, our priorities, our desires. And we seek to do his will, and we seek to follow a life that leads toward holiness, to be like him. We want to follow that light, for we don't like darkness at all. I've told you a lot about rural Ronnieville, Kentucky. That when my wife and I went to pastor that first little church in the hills of Kentucky, I told you stories about how we so fell in love with it, we wanted a piece of it. Every Sunday afternoon, we'd go walking in the thousands of acres of woods all around that community. I found a spot one day, way back in the woods. There was an old log cabin there that was collapsed. You could tell at one time there had been a field, but the sassafras and persimmon had taken over again, and it was all woods once more. I asked questions, found out that was the old McCoy place. And I began negotiating with all the McCoys, all 119 heirs. And to make a long story short, we bought that piece of ground. We wanted to make it our home. Right after I bought it, Sidney McCoy, one of the grandsons, said, I'll take you and show you the place. And so we went walking one Sunday afternoon, and I tried to follow Sidney. Now, Sidney's not built like me. Sidney's about 6'4", and I don't think he weighs 100 pounds. I can almost see through him. He was just such a beanpole. And his belt buckle came to about here on me. And as we walked together, I had a hard time following and keeping up with him over the fences and fields and finally into the woods, and we just went on through. He raced around and he showed me now, this was the old log cabin that my granddad lived in, and this was the old well where my grandma used to bring her clothes, and you can see where the fire was, where she boiled them in the kettle here right beside the well. And over here, this little clearing is where he had his tobacco patch, and on we went over those hills. I couldn't wait for Susan to get home. I wanted to show her all the things that I had seen and learned about that piece of ground we bought. She finally came in from work, and I said, honey, let's go up on the hill. I just want to show you what Sidney showed me today. And we raced from spot to spot, down the gullies and up the other side, scrambling all around the trees, and we came to this little clearing, which I thought he said was where the tobacco patch used to be. And all of a sudden, the sky got dark, and the clouds came, and it began to rain. And I said, well, we better head home. And as I walked out of that clearing back into the woods, it went down a steep hill, and I said, wait a minute, it's not supposed to do that. I said, I don't want to get lost here today, Susan, because if we make a wrong turn, it's 15 miles through the woods to Big Springs, so let's just spend the night here, and when the sun comes up, I'll know which direction to go, and we'll move on. She sat down by a tree and started crying. I said, what's the matter, honey? She said, I got to go to work tomorrow, and I left my rollers at home. Well, as I tried to comfort her, it wasn't long before the rain stopped. And even though the sun had already set, when the clouds dissipated, I could see the western sky where the sun had still left a little patch on the horizon. And I said, well, honey, we've got to go this way. And we went down, even though I knew down wasn't right, and back up, and we came to the clearing I thought I had been in all along. That light made all the difference in the world, especially in our marriage, okay? It was very important to know where you're going. And Jesus provides the course, the direction for our life. Now, one last thing, that last phrase, he says, not only I am the light of the world, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but he says, but shall have the light of life. I want to talk about the force of divine light. The force of divine light. Light is powerful. Not only does it poke holes in darkness, but light is powerful. I just read an article this week about a new laser that is able to poke a hole through an engine block at 8 miles away. That's light. That's powerful light. And Jesus comes into our life as a powerful force. First, it's a searching force. A searching force. Light comes in all sizes and shapes. And when His light comes into our life, it begins to show the difficulties, the sins. Did you notice what came immediately before this 12th verse? Verses 1 through 11 is all about the woman taken in adultery. And Jesus has scribbled something on the dirt, and all her accusers disappeared. And the preceding verse, He had asked her, "Where are your accusers?" And she said, "No man, Lord." And Jesus said unto her, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." And Jesus comes into our life as a searching force, and He begins to show us the weaknesses and the shortcomings and the sins. But because we're saved, we've been forgiven. And because we're saved, we see the light of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And we hear Him say, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." And His love begins to move us forward in a sense of real direction and peace, knowing that there is therefore now no condemnation, no matter what light will shine upon us. We've been forgiven. And we have the joy and peace of that forgiveness, because His light is a saving force, not just a searching force, but a saving force. Do you remember David in Psalm 27? He said, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" That when you know the light, that light brings a wonderful sense of salvation and peace. Malachi looked forward to that day. He said in the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse, that the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing on His wings. And he's talking about the S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness. For Jesus is that light, that Son of Righteousness. But as those rays, that rays of the sun, as they begin to hit us, they come to believers not in condemnation, but in healing, to change and to equip us for effective service. And finally, it's a shining force. A shining force. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, that it might give light to all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." That light has come into your life, and you are a shining force in the world. You've been asked to reflect that light of Jesus. He said He was the light of the world, but yet He turns around and says, "But you are the light of the world. I expect something from you, radically different." Some of you say, "Yeah, I might be a light of the world, but I'm pretty low wattage." Listen, it doesn't make any difference whether you're a 40-watt bulb or a 150-watt bulb or a 300-watt bulb. On that farm in Kentucky, we're not very far from Mammoth Cave area. And we had a half a dozen caves on our farm. And when I was skinny, I used to like to explore those caves. And you know, where you live in real darkness, like inside those caves, it doesn't take much light to make a difference. I used to always want to check the air when I got in the caves to make sure what kind of air it was, so I would never take just a flashlight. I always liked to have a candle or a lantern with me. Now, a candle and even a lantern doesn't give off much light. But when you're in a cave, it's a lot of light. It makes a big difference. And the world we live in is a dark world. We live with people that walk in darkness. And Christ has asked you and me to be the light of the world. And it doesn't make any difference whether you're just a 40-watt bulb or whether you've been blessed with more. You can make a difference. You can change the darkness all around you by letting the light of Jesus Christ shine through you. This morning, I challenge you to make that commitment to Him, that you will truly be the light of the world, that you will let His light shine through you.